My own daughter looked me in the eye, in a boardroom I built with my own two hands, and told me I didn't belong in it anymore. She said I was too old to understand what the business needed now. Said it in front of 6 strangers in suits. Said it like she'd rehearsed it in a mirror. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked out without a word. What she didn't know was that the man she'd just humiliated in front of her investors was about to become the only reason any of them still had a company to invest in. My name is Walt Sorensen. I'm 67 years old. I build furniture, or I did, with these hands, for almost 40 years. I live outside Asheville, North Carolina, in a stone farmhouse on Sardis Road that I paid off in 2003 and never once regretted buying, even during the years money was tight. For most of my life, I believed that if you built something honest and you built it well, it would protect you. I believed loyalty flowed downhill from a father to a daughter the same way it flows uphill from a daughter to a father. I was wrong about the second part, and it nearly cost me everything I'd spent a lifetime making. But I want to tell you about the one moment in this whole story I will remember until the day they put me in the ground. The moment a stranger in an expensive suit turned to my daughter in front of her whole investment team and asked to speak to me. Just me. Alone. Let me back up, because you need to understand what we built before I tell you how close we came to losing it. I started Sorensen Woodworks in 1988 out of a rented garage bay on Depot Street, back before the River Arts District in Asheville was anything anybody wanted to photograph. Back then it was warehouses and kudzu and the smell of the French Broad River when the water was low. I was 29 years old with a used table saw, a bank loan for $14,000 that my father-in-law co-signed because no bank in Buncombe County would touch a first-time business owner with a wife and an infant daughter, and a conviction that I could build furniture better than the factories cranking out particle board an hour up the highway in Tennessee. My wife Carol kept the books at our kitchen table until Renee was old enough to go to school, and then she kept them at the shop, in a back office with a space heater that never quite worked right. Carol passed in 2011. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed too late, gone in 14 months. I don't talk about that part much. I mention it now because it matters for what comes later, for what Renee said to me, and what Renee didn't understand about what her mother and I had actually built together. By 2015, we had 11 employees, a proper building on Depot Street with our name in iron letters over the door, and contracts with 3 boutique hotels in the region for custom lobby furniture. By 2020, we'd grown to 26 employees and had expanded into high-end kitchen cabinetry, working with architects doing renovations on the big estates out toward Biltmore Forest. I want to be clear about this, because people ask me sometimes if I regret handing the company to my daughter. I don't regret handing it to her. I regret how I handed it to her, and I regret not paying closer attention to who she'd surrounded herself with while I was stepping back. Renee is 34 now. She's my only child. She got her MBA from Wake Forest in 2016, worked 3 years at a furniture import company out of High Point doing supply chain work, and came home in 2019 wanting to modernize what I'd built. I was proud. God, I was proud. I made her chief operating officer that same year, and in 2022, when my knees started giving me trouble on the shop floor and I figured it was time, I made her chief executive officer and stepped back into a chairman role that was mostly ceremonial. I kept an office. I kept a desk. I kept showing up most days because 40 years of habit doesn't just switch off because your title changes. I told myself I was still useful. I told myself I still belonged in every room in that building. That's the part one was wrong about. Not the loyalty, the belonging. Because somewhere in those 3 years, my daughter had started listening to a different voice in her ear more than she listened to mine, and that voice belonged to a man named Derek Voss. Derek came into the picture in late 2020, introduced to Renee at a regional manufacturing conference in Charlotte. Smart, sharp dresser, an MBA of his own from Duke, a background in what he called growth finance, which as far as I could tell meant he'd worked at 2 companies that grew fast and then didn't exist anymore. They married in October of 2021, a small ceremony out at a vineyard in Marshall, and I walked my daughter down a gravel aisle between rows of muscadine grapes and told myself this was a good man, because that's what fathers tell themselves when their daughters are happy and they don't want to be the one who ruins it. Derek came on as chief financial officer in early 2022, right around the time Renee took over as CEO. Husband and wife, running the company I'd built from a garage bay and a co-signed loan. I told myself that was a beautiful thing. I didn't know it yet, but the numbers had already started moving in directions I couldn't see. Here's the thing about running a woodworking shop for 30-some years. You develop an instinct for material. You can walk into a lumber yard and know, just by the weight of a board in your hand, whether it's going to warp on you in 6 months. I never developed that same instinct for balance sheets, because I never had to. Carol handled the books when we were small, and once we grew, we hired a bookkeeper, and eventually Renee handled the financial side entirely. I built. That was my job. I built, and I trusted the people I loved to handle the rest. The first crack showed up on a Tuesday morning in March of last year, though I didn't understand what I was looking at until much later. I was in the shop, same as always, going over a walnut dining set with our head cabinet maker, a man named Sam Ruiz, who'd been with me 22 years by then. Sam started as an apprentice in 2003 straight out of a community college program, barely 20 years old, hands that shook a little the first time I put a chisel in them. 22 years later, he ran the production floor better than I ever had, knew every joint, every finish, every customer's particular fussiness, and he'd never once in all that time given me a reason to doubt him. Sam set down his coffee that morning and said, "Walt, can I ask you something, and you tell me if I'm out of line?" "You've never been out of line in 22 years, Sam. Go ahead." "The Blue Ridge sourcing invoices. The ones for the walnut and the hardware fittings on the Biltmore Forest jobs. You seen those?" I told him I hadn't. "Financial paperwork went through Renee and Derek's office now, not mine. I've been placing lumber orders here 22 years, Sam said. "I know every supplier we've used. I don't know Blue Ridge Sourcing. Never heard of them before 6 months ago. And the invoices are running high, Walt. Higher than what we'd normally pay for the same grade of walnut from Appalachian hardwood, who we've used since before I started here." I want you to sit with that for a second, because I did. Sam wasn't accusing anybody of anything. He was a craftsman flagging a discrepancy in materials, the same way he'd flag a warped board before it went into a finished piece. But something in my stomach went tight and cold, the way it does when a man who's never lied to you says something quiet and careful. I told him I'd look into it. I didn't, not right away. I told myself I was being paranoid, that my daughter and her husband were running a modern company with modern vendors, and I was an old man clinging to the way things used to be done. I let it sit for 6 weeks. I'm not proud of that, but I want you to understand something before this story goes any further, because it matters for what happened later. Doubting your own child feels like a betrayal all its own, even when the doubt is correct. I didn't want to be the father who couldn't let go, so I let go a little too long. It was Renee herself who finally forced my hand, though not in the way you'd expect. In late April, she called a full leadership meeting to introduce the company to a private investor she and Derek had been courting for months, a man named Marcus Webb, managing partner at a regional growth equity firm out of Charlotte called Ridgeline Capital Partners. The plan, as Renee explained it in a company-wide email, was a $2.3 million investment round that would fund a new production facility, expand our cabinetry line into 3 additional states, and, in her words, position Sorensen Woodworks for its next chapter. I read that email 3 times at my kitchen table. Its next chapter. Like the first chapter, the one with a rented garage bay and a co-signed loan and 37 years of my life in it, was something to be filed away and moved past. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning in May, in the same conference room where I'd signed the papers making Renee CEO 3 years earlier. I put on a collared shirt. I drove into Depot Street same as every morning, same as I had for 37 years, and I walked toward that conference room expecting to sit at the table the way I always had, because it had never once occurred to me that I wouldn't. Renee met me in the hallway before I reached the door. She had a tablet in her hand, and that particular look on her face, the one she used to get as a teenager right before she was about to tell me something she knew I wasn't going to like. "Dad," she said, "can we talk for a second?" "Sure, sweetheart. What's going on?" "This meeting today, it's a big one. Marcus and his whole team are coming in. I need everything to feel current, professional, forward-looking. I need it to feel like a company that's thinking about the next 20 years, not the last 37. I told her that was fine, that I understood, and I reached for the conference room door. "Dad," she said it again, softer this time, which somehow made it worse. "I think it's better if you sit this one out." I stood there in that hallway, in a building with my name on iron letters above the front door, and I asked her why. And she said it, word for word, and I will remember these words for the rest of my life. She said, You built something wonderful. Dad, I mean that. But you're not really the face of where this company is going anymore. Investors want to see growth, energy, someone who understands modern business. I love you, but you're 70 years old. It's not personal. I wasn't 70. I was 67. She'd rounded me up by 3 years without even noticing, which somehow stung worse than the sentence itself. I didn't argue with her. I want you to understand that about me, because it matters for everything that happened next. I am not a man who raises his voice in a hallway. I am not a man who makes a scene in front of employees who've spent their careers in a building that carries my name. I looked at my daughter for a long moment, and I said, "All right, Renee." And I turned around, and I walked back out through the front door, past the iron letters, out to my truck in the gravel lot. And I sat there for 20 minutes with my hands on the wheel before I could make myself turn the key. I didn't cry. I want to be honest with you, because people expect that part, and it didn't happen that way. What happened was quieter and colder than crying. Something in my chest just went still, the way a shop goes still at the end of a long day when you finally shut off the last machine and the silence rings in your ears. I drove home. I sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen table where Carol used to keep the books, and I thought about Sam Ruiz and the Blue Ridge sourcing invoices he'd flagged 6 weeks earlier. Invoices I hadn't looked into because I didn't want to believe there was anything to find. I thought about the fact that my own daughter had just told a room full of strangers, without me even present to defend myself, that I was a man from the past standing in the way of the future. I picked up the phone and called an old friend of mine, a retired attorney named Earl Bishop. Earl and I go back to 1991, when he handled the paperwork for our first commercial lease on Depot Street. He'd spent 38 years practicing business and contract law in Asheville before retiring 2 years back, and he still kept his license active because, as he put it, a man doesn't stop being useful just because he stops billing hours. "Earl," I said, "I need a favor, and I need you to be very good at what you do." "Walt Sorensen." He said my name slow, the way he always did when he knew something serious was coming. "What's going on?" I told him everything. The Blue Ridge sourcing invoices Sam had flagged. The investor meeting. What Renee had said to me in that hallway. Earl was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, and then he said the thing I needed to hear and didn't want to hear at the same time. "Walt, you're still chairman of that company. You're still a majority shareholder, aren't you?" I confirmed I was. Renee owned 30%. I still held 55%, and the remaining 15% sat in a small employee ownership pool Carol and I had set up back in 2009, split among the longest tenured staff, including Sam. "Then nobody locks you out of a conference room in a company you own the majority of," Earl said. "But before we talk about that, I want you to get me copies of every Blue Ridge sourcing invoice you can find, every purchase order, every payment record. I want to know who this vendor actually is before we do anything else." I didn't know it yet, sitting in that kitchen with the phone against my ear, but I was about to find out that the invoices Sam Ruiz had flagged were only the smallest visible edge of something much larger, something that had been quietly bleeding my company for the better part of 18 months. Sam got me the paperwork the next morning before Renee or Derek arrived at the office. The way you'd expect from a man who'd never once given me a reason to doubt him in 22 years. Purchase orders, delivery receipts, payment confirmations, all routed through Blue Ridge Sourcing LLC, a company registered, it turned out, when Earl ran the filing, not in North Carolina but in Delaware, incorporated in September of 2023, 5 months after Derek Voss became our chief financial officer. Earl called me back 2 days later, and his voice had that flat, careful tone I remembered from the handful of times over the decades he'd had to deliver me bad news about a contract or a lease. "Walt, I need you to sit down for this." I told him I was already sitting. "Blue Ridge Sourcing LLC," he said, "is registered to a P.O. box in Wilmington, Delaware. The registered agent is a formation service, which tells me somebody wanted this company hard to trace back to a real person. But Delaware requires an initial filing with a listed organizer, and I pulled it. The organizer of record is Derek Voss." I sat there in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, and I didn't say anything for a long moment. "There's more," Earl said. "I had a forensic accountant I trust, woman named Priya Anand out of Charlotte, look at the payment patterns on those invoices you gave me. Over the past 18 months, Sorensen Woodworks paid Blue Ridge Sourcing a total of $740,000 for hardwood lumber and hardware fittings. Priya cross-referenced the delivery weights and grades against what your actual supplier, Appalachian Hardwood, was invoicing for comparable material during the same window. Walt, the markup is somewhere between 40 and 60% above fair market value on every single invoice. I want you to think about that number for a second because I had to sit with it for longer than a second. $740,000. Money that came out of a company I'd built with a co-signed loan and a table saw in a rented garage bay, routed through a shell company my son-in-law had quietly created 5 months into his job as our chief financial officer, and the difference between fair price and what we'd actually paid had gone somewhere. I didn't know where yet, but I had a feeling, sitting in that kitchen, that I was about to find out, and I had a feeling it was going to be worse than a simple kickback scheme. I didn't know it yet, but the shell company wasn't even the most dangerous part of what Derek had built. The most dangerous part was still sitting in a folder on Renee's desk, waiting for a signature, and it was tied directly to the $2.3 million Marcus Webb was about to invest. Welcome back to Sweet Family Revenge Stories. If you're just joining us, grab a coffee, get comfortable, because this next part is where everything changed. If this story is hitting home for you already, go ahead and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. Now back to it. Earl and I met the following Monday at his home office out in Weaverville. A converted sunroom with law books he still hadn't gotten around to donating, and a view of the craggy mountains through the window behind his desk. Priya Anand joined us over video call from Charlotte, a sharp, careful woman in her 40s who spoke the way I imagine a surgeon speaks right before delivering a diagnosis, precise and unhurried. Mr. Sorensen, she said, I want to walk you through what I found in the investment round paperwork, because the shell company is actually the smaller problem. I told her I was listening. The $2.3 million round Ridgeline Capital is preparing to invest, she said, is structured with a change of control provision. It's fairly standard language in growth equity deals, but the specific terms here are not standard at all. If Sorensen Woodworks undergoes what the document defines as a material leadership transition within 18 months of closing, the CFO position, as structured in this document, receives an accelerated buyout of his equity stake at a valuation multiple tied to the post-investment company value, not the current value. Mr. Sorensen, your son-in-law currently holds an 8% equity stake in the company, granted to him when he became CFO. I felt something cold settle into my chest, the same feeling I'd had standing in that hallway outside the conference room. At current valuation, Priya continued, 8% is worth a modest sum. But once this investment closes and the company is valued at the new, higher figure that comes with $2.3 million in fresh capital, and if he triggers or is present for what the document calls a leadership transition, that 8% converts into a payout in the range of $940,000. Mr. Sorensen, I've seen a lot of these agreements. This one is written so that virtually any change at the top of the company, including something as simple as you resuming an active role or Renee stepping back for any reason, could arguably trigger that clause. Earl leaned forward in his chair. Walt, I don't think Derek is planning to build this company for the long haul. I think Derek is planning to trigger that clause, cash out close to $1 million, and walk away, likely not long after this round closes. I sat in that sunroom for a long moment, looking out at the mountains, thinking about my daughter sitting in her office right now, believing she was building the next 20 years of something her mother and I had spent our whole lives on, married to a man who had quietly built himself an exit ramp lined with siphoned lumber money and a contract clause designed to pay him nearly $1 million the moment he walked away from her. I want to pause here and tell you something, because I think it matters. I never once, not for a single moment in this whole ordeal, wanted to hurt my daughter. Everything I did from that point forward, I did to protect her, even when I wasn't sure she'd understand that's what I was doing. Some fathers in my position might have gone straight to her with the folder and demanded she believe me. I've lived long enough to know that's not how you save somebody from a lie they're standing inside of. You don't hand a drowning person more water and ask them to read it carefully. You have to get them to shore first, and sometimes the only way to do that is to let the current run its course a little longer, in a place where you control what happens when it does. I need to know one more thing before I decide what to do, I told Earl and Priya that afternoon. I need to know if this investor, this Marcus Webb, actually knows what he's about to put his firm's money into. Priya was quiet for a moment. That's the part one find most interesting, Mr. Sorensen. Ridgeline Capital Partners has an excellent reputation. They don't typically miss things like this in due diligence. I'd be very surprised if a firm with their track record hadn't already flagged at least some irregularity in the financials. That thought sat with me the rest of that week. If Marcus Webb's team had already found something, then somebody at that investor meeting, the one I'd been told I was too old to sit in, already knew more about my own company's books than I did. And that thought, more than anything Renee had said to me in that hallway, was the one that got me moving. I asked Sam Ruiz to quietly pull together anything else out of the ordinary he'd noticed over the past year, materials, deliveries, anything. Sam, God bless him, had been keeping a private notebook for months, the kind of careful, handwritten log a craftsman keeps out of habit, dates and grades and delivery weights, because something in his gut had been telling him to pay attention long before I'd asked him to. When he handed it to me, I told him I wanted to make sure he never regretted staying loyal to a company that hadn't always noticed how much it depended on him. He just shrugged and said, "Walt, you gave me my first job when nobody else would. I'm not going anywhere." I didn't know it yet, but that sentence was going to matter a great deal more than either of us understood in that moment. I spent the next 2 weeks quietly documenting everything, working with Earl and Priya after hours, staying out of the office during the day so as not to raise suspicion, letting Renee believe that our conversation in the hallway had simply been the end of the matter, that her father had accepted being politely retired from the room. I let her believe it because I needed the investment meeting with Marcus Webb to actually happen. I needed to see, with my own eyes, what kind of man was about to hand my daughter's husband the rope he needed to hang this company with. The meeting was rescheduled for a Thursday in June, this time framed as a full closing session, the final walkthrough before signatures. Renee sent a company-wide email announcing that Ridgeline Capital's team, including Marcus Webb himself, would be touring the production floor before the paperwork was signed in the conference room that afternoon. I read that email at my kitchen table and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not dread, something closer to readiness. I showed up to the shop that Thursday morning same as any other day, in my work clothes, not a suit, because I wasn't planning on being in that conference room. I was planning on being exactly where I'd spent 37 years of my life, at the workbench, with sawdust on my hands and a half-finished walnut credenza in front of me that I'd been restoring for a client out of Highlands. I figured if I wasn't welcome at the table, I would at least be standing in the one room in that building nobody could argue I didn't belong in. Marcus Webb's team arrived at 11 that morning. I heard them before I saw them, the particular sound of expensive shoes on a concrete shop floor, a sound that doesn't belong in a woodworking shop and never has. Renee led the tour, Derek beside her, both of them dressed sharp, both of them performing the kind of confident, forward-facing energy she'd told me investors wanted to see. I kept working. I didn't look up. I sanded the credenza's top rail with a piece of 220 grit and let the sound of the orbital sander fill the space around me. And then the tour stopped, right at my bench. I looked up, and there was a tall man in his 50s, silver at the temples, dressed in a gray suit that fit like it had been made for him because it had been, standing a few feet from my workbench, looking not at Renee, not at Derek, but directly at me. "You must be Walt Sorensen," he said. I set down the sander. "That's right." He extended his hand. "Marcus Webb, Ridgeline Capital. I've heard a great deal about you today, Mr. Sorensen, though I notice you weren't on the agenda." I saw Renee's face shift, that same careful, controlled look I remembered from the hallway. "My father's semi-retired," she said quickly. "He mostly focuses on craft work these days, not the business side." Marcus Webb didn't look away from me. "Is that right?" he said, and it wasn't really a question. He ran his hand along the edge of the credenza I'd been restoring, the joinery still visible where I'd hand-cut the dovetails on the drawer boxes the week before. "This is beautiful work, Mr. Sorensen. Genuinely. I don't see hand-cut joinery like this anymore, not in a production shop. Most places I tour, everything's a router jig and a finger joint." "Old habits," I said. "I've toured 11 furniture manufacturers in the last 4 years for potential investments," Marcus said. "This is the first one where the founder was still standing at a bench." I didn't say anything. I just watched him, the way you watch a man you haven't quite figured out yet. He turned to Renee. "I'd like a moment with your father before we go into the conference room. Alone, if that's all right. I want you to sit with that image for a second, because I've replayed it in my mind more times than I can count. My daughter, standing on a production floor she'd told me 2 weeks earlier I no longer belonged on. Watching a man with a checkbook worth more than our entire company asked to speak to the father she'd shut out, alone. Renee's face didn't hide it well. Confusion first, then something that looked almost like fear. "Of course," she said, her voice tight. "We'll be in the conference room." The whole tour group filed out, Derek glancing back at me once with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between curious and careful. And then it was just me and Marcus Webb standing in the shop, sawdust settling in the light coming through the high windows. "Mr. Sorensen," he said, once the door had closed behind them, "I'm going to be direct with you, because I have a feeling directness is a language you speak. My firm has spent 6 weeks on due diligence for this investment. Our forensic team flagged irregularities in a vendor relationship called Blue Ridge Sourcing 3 weeks ago. We also flagged the change of control provision your son-in-law wrote into the term sheet, the one that pays him close to $1 million the moment there's any leadership transition at this company." I felt something in my chest loosen just slightly, the first time in weeks. "We were prepared to walk away from this deal entirely," Marcus continued. "But before we did, I wanted to see the actual founder of this company with my own eyes. Because on paper, Mr. Sorensen, you're a chairman with a majority stake who was conspicuously absent from every meeting my team has had with this leadership over the past 4 months. I've seen that pattern before. It usually means one of two things. Either the founder has genuinely stepped away and doesn't care what happens to the company anymore, or the founder has been deliberately kept in the dark." I looked at this man, this stranger in an expensive suit standing in my shop, and I made a decision right then that I hadn't fully made until that exact moment. "Mr. Webb," I said, "I think you and I need to have a longer conversation than the one your schedule probably has room for today." He almost smiled. "Mr. Sorensen, I cleared my whole afternoon the moment I saw those dovetails. I brought him back to Earl's sunroom in Weaverville that same afternoon, and for 3 hours, with Priya on and on video call again from Charlotte, I laid out everything. The Blue Ridge sourcing invoices, the $740,000 in inflated markups, the Delaware filing with Derek Voss listed as organizer, the change of control clause, and the roughly $940,000 payout it would trigger." Marcus listened without interrupting, occasionally making a note in a small leather notebook, and when I finished, he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. "Mr. Sorensen," he finally said, "I want to be honest with you about something. My firm was still willing to consider closing this deal, restructured, with Derek Voss removed from any financial control position, and with additional protective covenants in place. We do this more often than you'd think. Founders build something good, and somewhere along the way, somebody close to the family starts helping themselves to the difference between what things cost and what the company gets built. It's not rare. It's just rarely caught this cleanly, this early. So what changed your mind about walking away entirely?" I asked. "You did," he said. "A company with an active founder still cutting dovetails at 67 years old, still paying attention, still willing to walk into a room and prove what he's saying with paperwork instead of accusations. That's not a company in decline. That's a company whose real value has been sitting in the wrong seat this whole time." He closed his notebook. "I'd like to restructure this deal so that the investment goes forward, but on new terms. Derek Voss removed entirely from financial control and from the cap table equity he currently holds, subject to what your attorney recommends given the fraud. And I'd like you back in an active operating role, Mr. Sorensen, not ceremonial. Real. Because frankly, the thing that convinced me this company was worth $2.3 million wasn't the growth projections in that deck your daughter's team put together. It was watching you sand a rail edge like the work still mattered to you." I sat there in Earl's sunroom, looking out at the craggy mountains going purple in the late afternoon light, and I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not vindication exactly. Something steadier than that. Something closer to purpose. "There's one more thing I need before we move forward," I told him. "I need my daughter to hear all of this from me, not read about it in a legal filing. I owe her that much." Marcus nodded slowly. "How do you want to handle it?" I told him my plan, and to his credit, he agreed to it without hesitation. We scheduled the closing meeting for the following Monday morning. The same conference room, the same table where 3 years earlier I'd watched Renee sign the papers making her CEO with more pride than I'd ever felt in my life. I asked Earl to be present. I asked Priya to join by video with her full report ready. And I asked Sam Ruiz to be there too. Not because he needed to be, but because a man who'd spent 22 years protecting this company with nothing but a careful eye and an honest notebook deserved to be in the room when the truth finally got said out loud. Monday morning came, and I put on a collared shirt for the second time in that story, and I drove into Depot Street. And this time I walked straight through the front door and down the hallway and into that conference room without anyone stopping me, because this time, nobody was going to. Renee was already seated when I walked in, Derek beside her, both looking sharp and confident, expecting to be signing away the next chapter of a company they believed was finally, fully theirs. Renee's face shifted when she saw me walk in and take a seat at the head of the table, the seat I hadn't sat in for 3 years. "Dad," she said, "what are you doing here? I thought we agreed." "We didn't agree to anything, Renee," I said, and I want you to understand my voice was calm. It was steady. I never raised it, not once in that entire meeting. You told me I wasn't welcome, and I let you believe I'd accepted that because I needed time to find out something first. Marcus Webb walked in behind me, Priya's face appearing on the conference room screen a moment later, and I watched my daughter's confidence drain out of her face in real time, the way water drains out of a tub when you pull the stopper. "Mr. Webb," she started, "I don't understand. We were told this was a closing meeting." "It is," Marcus said, taking a seat. "The terms have changed." I slid the folder Earl had prepared across the table, the same folder I'd sat within that sunroom weeks earlier, and I looked at my daughter, not at her husband, because everything I said next, I said to her. "Renee, 6 weeks ago Sam Ruiz noticed something wrong with our lumber invoices. A vendor called Blue Ridge Sourcing, charging us 40 to 60% above fair market price for material we'd been buying from Appalachian hardwood for over 30 years. I had it investigated. Blue Ridge Sourcing is a shell company registered in Delaware, and the person who filed the paperwork to create it is sitting right next to you." Derek's face went very still. "Over the past 18 months, I continued, this company paid $740,000 more than fair value for materials, routed through a company your husband quietly built 5 months after becoming our chief financial officer. And the investment round you were about to sign this morning had a clause in it, Renee, written by Derek, that would pay him close to $1 million the moment there was any leadership change at this company. Any change at all, including, potentially, me simply walking back into this room." The room was completely silent. I heard the air conditioning cycle on somewhere above us. "Renee," I said, and here my voice did change, not louder, just softer. "I didn't come back into this building to take anything away from you. I came back because I love you more than I love being right, and I couldn't watch you sign away the next 20 years of your life to a man who was already planning his exit before the ink dried." Renee turned to Derek, and I watched something happen on her face that I will never fully be able to describe to you. A kind of collapsing, quiet, and total, the specific look of someone realizing the floor they'd been standing on for 3 years had never actually been there. "Is this true?" she asked him, and her voice came out very small. Derek didn't answer right away, which was answer enough. "I want you to explain the shell company," Renee said, louder now. "Right now, Derek. Explain it." "Renee, I can explain everything. It's not what it. Explain the change of control clause," she said, cutting him off, and I watched my daughter, for the first time in this entire ordeal, become exactly the kind of steady, unshakable leader I'd always known she had inside her. "Explain why you wrote a clause into our investment terms that pays you almost $1 million if I ever step back from this company, or if my own father ever steps forward into it." Derek had no answer for that one either. He just sat there, and something in his posture told me he'd known this moment might come eventually. Some part of him had always known, and he'd simply gambled that it would come too late to matter. Priya spoke up from the screen, calm and precise as ever. "Mrs. Voss, I can walk you through the full financial documentation whenever you're ready. It's extensive, and it's conclusive." Renee didn't look at the screen. She was still looking at Derek. "Get out," she said quietly. "Get out of this building. I'll have my attorney contact yours." Derek stood, straightened his jacket in a gesture I recognized, the same kind of empty, practiced composure I'd seen in men trying to walk out of a room with whatever dignity they had left. He looked at me once on his way to the door, and I want to tell you I felt something like satisfaction, but honestly what I felt was closer to grief, The particular grief of watching a marriage end in a conference room instead of a courtroom, in front of witnesses, because that's the only place the truth had finally caught up to it. The door closed behind him. Renee sat very still for a long moment, and then she put her face in her hands, and I got up from the head of the table and walked around to her, and I did the only thing I knew how to do in that moment, which was put my hand on my daughter's shoulder the way I used to when she was small and scared of thunderstorms. "I'm so sorry, Dad," she said, muffled, into her hands. "I told you you didn't belong in this room. I was so wrong. I was so completely wrong about everything. I didn't say anything right away. I let her sit with it, because some things need silence more than they need forgiveness spoken out loud too fast. You built something wonderful with him in the plan," I finally said, "and I understand why you believed it. He was good at being believed. That's not a failure of yours, Renee. That's a skill he spent years practicing on people smarter than either of us." Marcus Webb cleared his throat gently. "Mrs. Voss, when you're ready, I still believe in this company. Ridgeline Capital still wants to close this investment. On new terms, with your father back in an active role, and with full protective governance going forward. This company is worth investing in, more than ever, actually, because of what just happened in this room. A company that catches its own fraud, cleanly, quickly, and with this level of documentation, that's a company I trust with my firm's money." Renee wiped her face and looked at him, then at me, then, finally, at Sam Ruiz, who had been sitting quietly at the far end of the table this entire time. "Sam," she said, "you're the one who noticed it. The invoices, weren't you?" Sam nodded. 22 years, Renee. You learn what things are supposed to cost. I want to tell you what happened over the following weeks, because this is the part of the story I'm proudest of, the part where something good actually got built out of everything that broke. Earl filed the paperwork within the week to formally remove Derek Voss's equity stake, citing fraud and breach of fiduciary duty, and Priya's documentation was thorough enough that Derek's own attorney advised him to settle rather than fight it. Forfeiting his 8% equity entirely and agreeing to repay $400,000 of the diverted funds over a 5-year period. A legal outcome Earl described as about as clean as these things ever get without a courtroom. The divorce filing came 2 weeks after that. Renee didn't cry about it in front of me, not once, though I know she did plenty of it alone, and I let her have that privacy, because grief for a marriage you believed in is its own kind of grief, and it doesn't need an audience. The investment closed 6 weeks later, restructured on Marcus Webb's new terms. I came back into the company as co-CEO alongside Renee, not because I wanted my old title back for its own sake, but because Marcus was right. This company needed both of us, the parts of it that looked forward and the parts of it that remembered where it started. Renee and I sat down together, just the two of us, at that same kitchen table where Carol used to keep the books, and we redesigned the leadership structure from the ground up, this time with covenants that made sure no single person could ever again quietly build themselves an exit ramp out of company funds. And here's the part one most want you to hear, because I promised myself when I started telling you this story that I'd tell you about the sweetness in it too, not just the reckoning. Sam Ruiz, the man who'd noticed a discrepancy in a lumber invoice because 22 years of honest attention had taught him exactly what things were supposed to cost. The man who kept a quiet notebook out of nothing but loyalty and instinct. The man who never once asked for anything in return. I brought him into Earl's office 3 weeks after the investment closed, and I handed him a folder of his own. Inside it was a 6% equity stake in Sorensen Woodworks, carved out of my own remaining ownership, along with a new title, Director of Production and Craft Standards, a role we built specifically for him, with a salary that finally matched what he'd been worth to this company for over 2 decades. Sam sat there in Earl's office holding that folder, and for the first time in 22 years of knowing him, I watched this steady, careful man's hands actually shake. "Walt," he said, "I didn't do any of this for a reward." "I know that, Sam," I told him. "That's exactly why you deserve one." We finished the walnut credenza together, Sam and I, side by side at my old workbench, the week the investment closed. It went out the door to that client in Highlands with hand-cut dovetails and a finish we'd both signed underneath. A small tradition we started that week and still keep today. Our initials in pencil under every major piece, right where nobody sees it but us. It felt right, marking the work that way, quietly, the two of us, The way the best things in this life usually get built, without anybody watching, without anybody needing to. Renee and I run this company together now, and I won't tell you it's been simple, because grief and betrayal don't clean up as neatly as a legal settlement does. Some mornings she still apologizes for that hallway conversation, and some mornings I still catch myself waiting to be told I don't belong somewhere. An old habit, a scar that takes longer to fade than the wound that made it. But most mornings now, she walks past my bench on her way to her office and puts her hand on my shoulder the way I used to put mine on hers. And she says the same thing every time, quiet, like it's become its own kind of prayer between us. She says, "I'm glad you're in the room, Dad. I built this company out of a rented garage bay and a table saw and a loan co-signed by a man who believed in a 29-year-old kid nobody else would take a chance on. I built it again, in a different way, at 67 years old, at a table in a hallway I'd been told I didn't belong in, with a folder full of evidence instead of a chisel, because it turns out the thing I actually built all those years, the thing that mattered more than any dovetail or any invoice, was a company full of people who noticed when something was wrong and cared enough to say so. My daughter learned the hardest lesson of her life in that conference room, and I learned one too, one I should have already known after nearly 40 years running this business. You can build the finest joinery in the world, tight enough to hold without a single nail, and it will still fail you if you don't check, every so often, who's been standing quietly at the bench beside you the whole time, waiting to be trusted with something real. If this story meant something to you, go ahead and hit that like button, drop a comment, and let us know where you're watching from, and subscribe to Sweet Family Revenge Stories so you never miss the next one. I'll see you in the next story.